Hello and welcome back to Voxterra. Today, lab-grown meat, a solution to the climate crisis and animal cruelty, or yet another monstrosity of consumer capitalism. Let's ask ourselves what economic interests are served by both opposing it as well as supporting it. What do actual environmental and animal rights organizations have to say about it, and how does it fit in with their vision, as I'm distilling it for you? And are there other ethical concerns? Is lab-grown meat a bold vision for a better, healthier future, or a dystopian greenwashing? And to shed some light on that last question, towards the end I'll be referring to two of my favorite sci-fi authors. Now, we could argue that opposing lab-grown meat is just a backdoor to supporting the big agriculture, especially the large cattle ranchers. When I noticed one of those ringing the alarms about lab-grown meat was the Epoch Times, well, I consider the Epoch Times to be what I call a mouthpiece of the reckless elements of the business community. So that would seem to support that first view. Also seeming to support that first view would be the fact that I noticed that the Sierra Club, an environmental group I've got loads of respect for, had an article that I interpreted as hopeful about lab-grown meat, as did PETA, or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. But does that mean that lab-grown meat is really within their vision? But first, before I get to that, what the heck is lab-grown meat? Well, citing CNN, lab-grown meat, or cultivated or cell-based meat, is meat that is developed from animal cells and grown with the help of nutrients like amino acid in massive bioreactors. And the article describes these bioreactors as looking a lot like a brewery, only with people in lab coats. So what about this here environmental vision and lab-grown meat as a form of climate change solution? Well, if we look at the EPA's sources for greenhouse gas emissions, or a lot of other places, really the lion's share of it has accumulated from the excessive burning of fossil fuels, with agriculture playing a more secondary role in that. My understanding is a large part of why agriculture plays a role in that is due to deforestation, especially again related to cattle ranching. Another role is played by the use of petrochemical-based fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, as well as this large-scale method of growing monocrops intended for export rather than for local-based consumption, which gets us into all the shipping costs and the shipping fuel consumption of just shipping all this product around. Well, addressing all of those climate-related or even environmental-related impacts of agriculture has been a part of the environmental movement's North Star over my lifetime, but it has never called for lab-grown meat. Whether we hear terms like eat local, farm to table. Now I'm hearing the concept of food sovereignty and local food sovereignty. That way you're not shipping everything around, burning all those fossil fuels, or using whatever energy source to move the product. Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal even included a component for encouraging home gardens. Well, those pesticides and herbicides aren't just bad for the target pests and target plants, they're also bad for people, in addition to using fossil fuels as a feedstock to produce those chemicals. And that's part of the reason why the environmental movement has long championed organic agriculture, and now what we hear called sustainable agriculture or regenerative agriculture. But most of these concepts argue for living more in harmony with nature rather than trying to completely rewrite nature. Agroforestry as a solution to the cattle ranching and clear cutting. Two methods of that I've seen: grazing the cattle among tree canopy, as well as using mixed crops where you've got, fruit-bearing trees and then some type of ground crop growing alternately or within the same space, more harmonious, more in keeping with the natural setting, providing shade and habitat. Also, across much of my life, I've heard arguments for a more plant-based diet, the idea being that raising crops to then feed to the animals is more resource intense than just raising the crops and feeding them to the people. And if people were not so uptight about eating insects, while they seem to have no problem eating chickens and cows and pigs, well, couldn't a natural pest solution be eating those insects? But that, of course, also gets us into other types of animal cruelty and how the insects are treated. So now let us jump to animal cruelty and slaughter, and lab-grown meat is a solution to that problem. Well, the North Stars of the ethical treatment of animals movements that I've encountered over my lifetime have been calling for standards on how to treat animals, like free range, more space, not crowding the pigs in particular into these little horrible hemmed-in cages their entire lives. And not just do these mass crowded conditions seem cruel to these living sentient creatures, or I believe they are, and I believe there's a lot of evidence they are. Those crowded conditions are breeding grounds for new diseases. And those animals' diseases kept at bay there by pumping those animals full of antibiotics, which then creates antibiotic-resistant diseases. And what about standards for how, when animals are slaughtered? By when, I mean when in their lifespan. Like when I was younger, I remember a lot of outrage about veal, eating very young, basically baby cows. And really, we could argue the same for sheep. Our society seems to have this distaste for what used to be called mutton. I've heard people who've ate mutton back when it was still a thing you could get commonly say, oh, it was so chewy and hard to eat. I'm like, okay, so it's chewy and hard to eat, so you're going to eat a sheep, which is basically a very young, you're going to eat a lamb, rather, I mean to say, lamb chops. And there haven't been large-scale debates about this aspect of our agriculture, any of these aspects, be it the pesticides, the herbicides, the mass-scale monocrops, the cruelty to the animals, because the same reason there haven't been really big debates about cutting back on fossil fuels, because of the power of these industries in our government, in our media, and then in the thinking of the public who can't even see other solutions. Other than let's find some technological breakthrough that's magically going to change it all, and usually it doesn't change it all, it's just one more thing added into the mix. And I'd have to add, there seems to be this, another way that our public is manipulated, I think, is because people have this idea they've got a magnified sense of their free will, that everything they think is their thought. They're not getting it from the media. And they have this resistance to following any rules that are for the public good. And this not addressing the behaviors causing it, not addressing the commercial mechanisms pushing for cruelty, is similar to me to how our society is handling cancer, rather than addressing the fact that so many of these products, the constant manufacturing of plastics and the same pesticides I mentioned, and the daily burning of auto exhaust is all carcinogenic. Rather than addressing that, just fund a cure, fight for a cure, race for the cure, but just keep polluting away. And the climate crisis hope for big carbon-sucking machines, but I never heard about big methane-sucking machines, by the way. Rather than, let's give up these big gas guzzlers, or question why we moved from little subcompacts in the 70s and 80s to massive gas guzzlers in the 2000s. What happened here? I mentioned other ethical concerns. Well, I feel there's this arrogance, like people have it all figured out. And people think, oh, this tissue doesn't feel anything. But you know what? We don't really know how sentience consciousness works. We don't really know that it's all limited to the nerve cells. There's new evidence now in Scientific American arguing for insect sentience. Granted, they have nerve cells. But my point here is that these muscle tissues that are being grown in vats evolved as part of a whole body system. They didn't evolve to simply live separate in a big glob in a vat. Or if you don't like the term evolution, they weren't intelligently designed by the creator to exist in a big vat. They were designed by the creator to be part of an animal's whole system. And as there is this great slogan, system change, not climate change, I feel again here we don't want to change our system of how we grow agriculture or how we raise animals. Rather, we're just going to keep doing it this way and hope for a technological breakthrough that will somehow dispense with the whole thing. And remember that CNN article did mention that raising meat in these vats requires a lot of power. Now, one person pointed out, well, hey, that power could come from renewable resources. That's better than coming from fossil fuels, in my opinion, or nuclear. But raising animals and growing crops does not inherently require a lot of power. It's just the way it's being done. Now, in terms of the long-term survival of our species, let me just go back to sci-fi. Isaac Asimov, in one of his novels I remember reading, envisioned a future with humanity spread throughout the galaxy. And in some of those parts, they're growing their food in these large vats. And the vats, if I remember correctly, were yeast-based products. Well, point one is they weren't animal tissues in those vats. They were yeast. And point two is they were being done, that lifestyle was a way to sustain humanity throughout the stars, throughout the cosmos. But here we're just talking about doing this on Earth for nothing especially grandiose, because people are not willing to stand up to these industries that are being cruel to animals, not willing to change business practices, and not willing to support local small-scale farming, as was called for in Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal. Well, I suppose lab-grown meat could have a hopeful purpose for humanity, although personally I find it disturbing. Everything here is done for commercial purposes. We do not have a wise, benevolent government of some sort ran by an independent public body, independent of commercial interests. We don't have a socialist economy where policy is debated among the people and it's just disentangled, at least as we would envision socialism or a public sector economy. It's disentangled from those commercial interests. It isn't. It's all caught up in commercial thinking. That's why it's important to keep in mind your North Star, what kind of society you want to live in, what you want it to look like. And in Margaret Atwood's book, Oric and Crake, or at least in one of the books in the series, just before the collapse of human civilization, which in her series it was brought on intentionally, a bit of a spoiler there if you read it, one of the main characters went to a lab, and this was written back in 2003, so this is before lab-grown meat was approved by the FDA. He went to a lab where they were growing lab-grown meat and thought to himself, you know, this feels like a bridge too far, but then when he got them at the local chain store, chain restaurant, they were thought called chicken nubbins, I believe. He thought, oh, these don't taste too bad. And then shortly after, society collapsed. Well, that is not what I'm rooting for us. I'm rooting for our survival. But I just want to point out, you really got to ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? What do you want this world to look like? And is this really a solution in keeping with that? Or is it yet another, let's not address pollution to stop cancer, let's just find a cure but keep polluting type of solution? Well, hey partner, I hope you found this interesting, informative. If you did, please make sure you subscribe, you're liking, you're commenting. And as always, until next time, and thank you for supporting a Patreon, my two patrons, Bella Grissi and Environmental Coffee House. And as always, until next time, peace be with you.